all know what the real story was, the big story, and that was Brian Kelly's debut at LSU. And for about 3 quarters, it was not good. Frankly, really, for about 4 quarters, it was not good. But really, if you really just want to know about this specific game, and really why we love college football as much as we do, all you got to do is go to the final few minutes of this game, right? So I'm not going to tell you, oh, this happened in the second quarter, and in the third quarter, this happened, and then out of halftime. No, everything you need to know essentially happened in the final 2 minutes of the game. So let's get into it. Let's discuss that final 2 minutes. One of the craziest sequences that I have ever seen as a college football fan, a sports fan, but we all know how it goes. Florida State in complete control. They were the better team for the vast majority of that game. Go into the fourth quarter with a 14-point lead. LSU cuts the lead to 7, and all of a sudden, a Florida State program that you can start to feel the tension in the air. They haven't really had that signature win of the Mike Norvell era, almost like a little bit like a Nebraska. When things go wrong, you kind of get the sense that the program just kind of expects the worst to happen. Well, what ends up happening in the final 2 minutes? Just bananas, right? LSU on defense forces a punt. They have cut the lead to 7 at this point. And you just sit there and think, oh my goodness, LSU is going to get the ball back and tie the game, send this to overtime, and it's going to be bananas. Florida State punts it. LSU muffs the punt inside the red zone. Florida State recovers inside their 20, inside their 10. And essentially all they got to do is run 3 plays, run out the clock, kick a field goal. They're up 7. And if they kick that field goal, it's game over. You're talking about a 10-point lead with under a minute to go. LSU, which could not move the ball all day. We'll talk about them in a minute. Could not move the ball all day. All you got to do, just fall on the ball 3 times, kick a field goal, go home with the win. But because it's college football, that's exactly the opposite of what happened. As Florida State, a few nice plays, pick up a few yards, force LSU to call a timeout. And then on the goal line, on the 1-yard line, we all know what happened from there. Florida State fumbles the football. Up 7, under 2 minutes to go, and LSU recovers. LSU starts making plays. Jaden Daniels, to his credit, and we'll talk about him momentarily, was phenomenal on that final drive. The transfer quarterback from Arizona State takes LSU essentially the length of the field. They're getting close. They're getting into the red zone. Throws a pass to a kid named Mason Smith, true freshman, Mason Taylor, son of Jason Taylor, obviously the iconic former Miami Dolphin. He dives out of bounds, 1 second left. Oh my goodness, they're going to have one play to decide it. Only his knee goes down. We have about a 6-minute review. All of a sudden, the refs say because it's a first down, there is one untimed play. LSU, Jaden Daniels drops back, touchdown pass, and again, second time in a minute. All we got to do, just kick the extra point and the game is over. Florida State, all they had to do was kick a field goal and the game was over. They couldn't do it. LSU lines up. Kicker drops back. Kicker kicks. Blocked by Florida State. And Florida State wins the game by 1 point. Final score in the Superdome, 24-23. And when I think about this game, a couple things come to mind. First, I thought Greg McElroy he kind of explained it perfectly to end the game. Greg McElroy was calling the game for ESPN. He said, look, this is why we love college football, right? We spent all offseason complaining and it's over and college football is never going to be the same. The transfer portal, NIL, expansion. And then we have a game like that and you're like, oh, this is why we love this sport. And I think I thought that was on full display, right? Is that there are some sports, right? You're not watching a random NBA game featuring 2 unranked, there's no rankings in the NBA, but 2 lousy teams on a Tuesday just because you don't know what's going to happen. Same with college basketball, even the NFL. You don't get stuff like we had in the Superdome in New Orleans on Sunday night, where Florida State, all they got to do is kick the field goal to win the game. They fumble on the 1-yard line. LSU drives the length of the field, gets an extra play, scores. All they got to do to force overtime is to kick the PAT, and instead the PAT gets blocked. So that was what happened, right? And one thing we always do on this show, we give you the who, what, when, where, why, and then we give you the context of what it means. And I will say this, as I said a minute ago with Utah, Florida, oftentimes the more interesting story is in the losing locker room. And I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that the more interesting story in this case is in the losing locker room. And that certainly comes from LSU. Now, listen, I'm not going to do what everybody else in the media and everybody else on social media does. I'm not going to sit here and just tear Brian Kelly apart. Oh, he's the worst coach ever and he's never going to make it. And did you see that video of him dancing with his recruits and he's so out of touch? That's not what this is about. Listen, you guys and girls, I think if you've been listening to this show, you know where I stand on Brian Kelly. I think he's one of the great coaches of my lifetime, right? Was at Grand Valley State, led them to multiple national titles at the D2 level. Went to Central Michigan, builds that program up, goes to Cincinnati. They were in the same conference as my alma mater, UConn, watched him up close and in person. He was awesome there. And then, of course, goes to Notre Dame. And you can criticize Notre Dame for not winning the big one, but they won a ton of games, especially late in Brian Kelly's career. And I do think that he is going to figure things out at LSU. So if you're an LSU fan listening, if you're an LSU fan watching, this isn't going to be what every other guy that covers college football, oh, Brian Kelly, the accent, the dancing, he doesn't know what he's doing. No, I think the guy is going to be okay. But what I do think also was on display on Sunday night is that this is really going to be a rebuild, and this is where I would be concerned if I was an LSU fan. I think anytime there's a coaching change, right, I think there's just this immediate assumption everything is going to be hunky-dory, everything's going to be incredible, our program's going to be great, we're going to be back to winning national championships in no time. And the reality is that's really not the case in most places. I mean, even across college football this week, Florida had an incredible win, but, Florida was a Cam Rising, throw the ball away, or Cam Rising finding a guy in the end zone from losing at home to Utah. Like, let's make no mistake about that. So everyone's excited about Florida today. Same with USC. USC destroys Rice. Let's see what happens when they have to play Oregon, Utah, whatever. So it's a building process, and I'm not ready to jump off the Brian Kelly bandwagon yet. But I also think that we saw on Sunday, there are some real concerns for this LSU team. And a lot of it really is just a trickle-down effect from the Coach O era, right? Is that, again, I think we think LSU, all these athletes, top recruiting classes. If you watched LSU last year, most of the same problems that they had a year ago were very much on display on Sunday night in the Superdome. First of all, Jaden Daniels was awesome. I'll give him credit because that was a kid. I watched him in the Pac-12. I live in Pac-12 country. I host Fox Sports Radio Saturdays at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I probably watch more Pac-12 football than most people. I didn't think Jaden Daniels was that good, but that kid overall was absolutely fantastic on Saturday night at the Superdome. Jaden Daniels, the transfer quarterback, 209 yards passing, 114 yards rushing for the transfer quarterback. So he was great. The problem was everybody else. And if you go back to last year with LSU, and if you're an LSU fan, I know you're watching or listening, and you know what your biggest problem was last year. Couldn't run the ball, couldn't block anybody up front. And that was exactly what was on display on Sunday night. LSU finishes the game. How about this? This is a crazy stat. So Jaden Daniels, 114 yards rushing from the quarterback position, okay? You know how much LSU had rushing the rest of the game from everybody else? 25 yards. 25 yards rushing from LSU, and that was in 14 attempts. So I'm not great at math, but when you have 14 rush attempts and you have 25 yards rushing, that is not a good sign. I think beyond that, it was, again, a lot of what was the problem for Coach O at LSU. Go back to last year. What was the number one conversation about LSU on the field, off the field? It was discipline. It was a lack of discipline. It was a lack of discipline, by the way, from the coach. We heard all the stories about Coach O after he got fired, but then there was a lack of accountability in the program, and there was a lack of accountability with the players because of the coach, not blaming 18, 19-year-olds when your coach is out of control. But what I think is it trickled down onto the field, and that was exactly what we saw on Sunday night in New Orleans. Go back and look at that game. Think about all the mental – forget the fact that LSU couldn't run the ball. Think about all the mental mistakes that LSU made throughout the game, okay? Just think about all of the correctable, fixable things. There was a blocked field goal early in the game, obviously became a factor late. The 2 kickoff fumbles by Malik Neighbors. I don't mean to call out a kid, but call a spade a spade. Had 2 fumbles on punts. That's not good. There was a dumb, unnecessary roughness penalty from 5-star linebacker Harold Perkins right in front of a ref. Greg McElroy called it out like, dude, what are you doing? Ali Gay, one of the leaders of your team, ejected for targeting in the most obvious targeting, maybe in the history of football. I mentioned the 2 turnovers, the 2 fumbles on punt returns. By the way, there was one punt that went 31 yards. Punter that Brian Kelly brought from Notre Dame, 31 yards. And then finally, of course, the blocked PAT. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what it speaks to. By the way, this is why Brian Kelly was hired. He's an accountability structure guy. The thing you could always say about Notre Dame, sometimes they didn't have as much talent as the other team, most notably when they played Alabama and Clemson. But very rarely, if ever, did they beat themselves. And that was all LSU did. LSU, the issue was never talent. It was always beating themselves. That's why Brian Kelly was brought in. But I do think it became pretty obvious that maybe the rebuild is a little bit more, strenuous than I think a lot of us thought. Finally, and this is, again, it goes back to accountability, discipline, structure. See what happened on Monday morning after the game? Kayshon Boutte, love the name. They called him Booty during the game, but I've always called him Kayshon Boutte, and nobody's ever corrected me. After the game, Monday morning, your best player, arguably, certainly your best NFL draft prospect, wide receiver, doesn't get a bunch of touches during the game on Sunday, has a couple of drops. He doesn't look like himself. He's coming off injury. But this was a guy that Brian Kelly called out during the offseason, that he wasn't doing what he needed to do to get back on the field. See what he did after Monday morning? He went ahead and deleted everything LSU related off of his Instagram account. Now, maybe it means nothing. Maybe it means nothing. But to me, again, it speaks to the accountability, the discipline, the fact that this is what LSU was under Coach O. This is what LSU was under Les Miles, and this was what Brian Kelly was brought in to fix. I'm not calling Kayshon Boutte the worst person in the world, but at the same time, how many Alabama guys do you see just delete everything off Instagram when they're mad after a loss? Did Bryce Young do that after they lost to Georgia? Did Bryce Young do that after they lost to Texas A&M last year? Do you ever see that stuff at Ohio State? Jackson Smith and Jigba doesn't get enough touches, so he's going to delete stuff off Instagram. Do you see it at Clemson? Do you see it at Georgia? Is Stetson Bennett running it? It speaks to a level of immaturity from what should be one of your leaders of this team, a third-year player and very much an NFL draft prospect. By the way, at the very least, if you're an NFL draft prospect, just don't do something dumb that brings attention to you. So I'm not criticizing the kid, but I do think it speaks to a lack of accountability, and I do think it speaks to, in my opinion, some bigger picture issues that Brian Kelly has to fix. We just talked about it a minute ago with Billy Napier. Can you change a culture overnight and over an offseason? It looked like Billy Napier in week 1 did a pretty good job of it. We'll see about Brian Kelly. I'm not ready to give up on Brian Kelly, but all of the problems that plagued this team last year were very much in play on Sunday night in New Orleans.